If you haven't been living under a rock for the past 30 years, chances are you've come across the word indie. There are indie games, indie movies, indie rappers, you name it. But indie is still most closely associated with rock music. I mean, pretty much all guitar-based music that is not metal or Latin jazz or whatever is labeled indie rock these days. It seems that indie has become just another buzzword like vintage or urban. A word used to sound hip and fashionable, or to sell someone your bullshit product. The word has lost all meaning and has almost nothing to do with what it originally stood for. And that bothers me, because indie has a very deep and interesting history, and I feel like the way we use the word nowadays is shitting all over that history. With this video, I want to tell you guys a little bit about the history of indie music and explain why and how indie became the buzzword it is today. So bear with me, children, as I rant about the meaninglessness of indie. The word indie comes from the word independent, which in the context of music refers to the type of record label the music is released on. Because originally, labeling music as indie wasn't about how the music sounded, what the musicians looked like, or what kind of people listened to it. It simply meant the music was released and distributed by an independent record label. A label that's run and owned by people outside of the mainstream music business. Small independent record labels have been around for fucking ever, but only since the late 70s have they been a serious part of the music industry. Because before then, recording music and pressing records was so freaking expensive that if you wanted to be a band on a professional level, you had to sign to a major label. Even early punk bands like The Clash, The Ramones and the Sex Pistols were signed to major labels, for God's sake. But in January 1977, a punk band from Manchester called the Buzzcocks released their first EP called Spiral Scratch via their own independent record label without any industry connections or help from a major label.
Whatever makes me sick, it takes away my concentration. It's such a hazard traveling, it gave me frustration. I break down, I gotta break it down, yes. I gotta break down, I gotta break it down, yes.
Spiral Scratch was an instant hit in the British punk scene and even caught the attention of legendary radio DJ John Peel. The Buzzcocks showed people that you can circumvent the greedy major label music business by releasing your music independently. And you can even be kind of successful doing it, at least on a national level. This idea totally matched punk's DIY spirit and laid the foundation for the independent music scene that followed. Because after Spiral Scratch, independent record labels started popping up like wildflowers. Not only in England, but all over Europe and the US people started their own labels. Rough Trade, SST, Discord, Mute, Creation, the list goes on. Every label had its own niche style, but they all shared a do-it-yourself work ethic and a love for new, cutting-edge music that often had a kind of amateurish quality to it. Throughout the 80s, some of the more melodic and accessible bands from independent labels began attracting relatively big audiences. Think of bands like R.E.M., The Smiths and the Pixies. Because of this, people started associating independent music with these kind of jangly, emotional, slightly experimental guitar bands, which led to indie or indie rock being treated as a genre of music instead of just a way to release music. By the late 80s, some of the biggest indie bands were even signed to major labels, like R.E.M., who signed a deal with Warner Brothers after leaving independent label IRS, or even the Jesus and Mary chain, who were also signed to Warner, weirdly enough. But when shit got really blurry is when Nirvana broke through in the early 90s. Cause here you have a band that was first signed to an independent label, Sub Pop, then signs $1 million deal with major label DGC, and then becomes one of the biggest rock bands of all time, while still embodying the punk spirit that independent music was known for. Like I said, Nirvana were not the first indie band on a major label, but they were the first who managed to become a global fucking phenomenon, Beatlemania style, without being labeled as a total sellout by the indie scene. Bands like Smashing Pumpkins, Oasis and Radiohead soon followed, and the definition of what was and wasn't indie got more and more vague. Not only were so-called alternative rock bands topping the charts, some of the bigger indie labels even signed distribution deals with major labels. Alan McGee and his label Creation Records, for example, one of the most respected and well-known indie labels of the 80s, sold half the company to Sony in 1992, mostly for financial reasons, which makes you question what happened to indie's original DIY spirit, Plus, a few years later you started having pop rock bands like Coldplay and The Killers, who had nothing to do with the independent music scene, being marketed as indie rock just because their music kind of resembled that of bands from the independent labels. Of course, there were still a lot of real indie bands and labels, like Matador, Warped, or even hip-hop labels like Definitive Jux. But the distinction between the underground and the mainstream music industry wasn't as clear as it was back in the 80s. And I'd say that with the rise of the internet in the 2000s, that distinction has almost completely evaporated. Because even in the 90s, with alternative rock being as popular as it was, you still needed some help from a major label if you wanted to really hit it big. But in the 2000s, artists like LCD Sound System, the Arctic Monkeys, Odd Future, or even Soulja Boy for fuck's sake, proved that you can build a huge fanbase online and become a global success without any help from a major label. Because when an album like Whatever People Say I Am, That's What I'm Not by the Arctic Monkeys becomes the fastest selling debut album in British history while being released by a small independent record label, we have to ask ourselves, what's the point of calling music indie in this day and age? Because when music is mostly distributed and consumed online via file sharing websites, or nowadays streaming services like Spotify and SoundCloud, where everyone can upload their own music for free or maybe a few bucks and have a potential audience of millions, what's really the difference between a corporate celebrity pop star like Ariana Grande and an indie darling like Snail Mail? They spread their music through the same streaming services, they both sell their concert tickets via Ticketmaster, and they communicate with their fans via the same social media websites. One may be a lot more popular than the other, but the way they function as artists is pretty much the same. Because there was a time when being signed to an independent record label and being an indie artist meant that you did not have access to the same television gigs, radio stations, music festivals, and therefore a mainstream audience as someone who was signed to a major label. I'm not saying that music was necessarily better off because of it. I mean, it took the Smiths almost 3 decades to get the mainstream recognition they deserve, mostly because their music was released by an independent label. While nowadays, an artist like Chance the Rapper can become a household name without even signing a record deal. But I do think it's stupid to keep using the word indie as if there is still this small, hidden music scene that is completely independent of the whole mainstream music business. Because when this gets sold to you as indie, maybe it's time to put the final nail in the coffin and let the word go gracefully, before it really starts to smell.
A jumped up country boy